Hey, Rob here for Quadratec.com. Today we're going to be showing you how easy it is to install an Alpine X409-WRA-JL 9-inch Restyle system into your 2018 or newer Jeep Wrangler JL or your 2020 and newer Jeep Gladiator JT. Now, before we can begin any of the installation steps here in the Jeep, however, we do need to remove that Maestro module from the box, and you will need access to a PC computer and the internet, so you can head over to the idatalinkmaestro.com website and then follow the steps specific to your vehicle so that you can program that module to work correctly with your Jeep. Now, why don't we go ahead under the hood so we can get started on the install. Now, the first step we need to do before we begin working on anything inside of our Jeep is to go ahead and disconnect our negative battery terminals. Now, with the JL and JT, there's actually 3 terminals we need to make sure that we're disconnecting and isolating. There's 2 on top, and then of course the main negative terminal. You've got one 13mm and 2 10mm nuts. And once I disconnect those, I like to isolate them by wrapping some tape around them just to be sure that they don't make contact while we're working. There are 6 clips holding the knee panel under the steering column. We just need to pull that panel out of the way. It may be helpful to use a nylon panel tool to remove that. There are 10 clips holding the HVAC panel in place. We simply need to pull that away. Again, a nylon panel tool can help you in pulling that apart. Once you have the panel removed, there are 2 electrical harnesses to disconnect, one on the back of the HVAC panel and one on the back of the stop-start button. There are 2 Phillips head screws behind the HVAC panel that hold the radio bezel in place. Once we have the screws removed, there are 6 clips holding the bezel to the dash. We can go ahead and pull that out of the way. With the bezel removed, there are 4 Phillips head screws retaining the radio, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. We can remove those screws and then remove the radio. And then we can disconnect all of the electrical harnesses on the back side of the radio. To remove the glove box, first open it, remove any contents, then lift up on the soft close mechanism and pull inward to disconnect it from the glove box. Pushing up on the tab underneath the dash, you can drop the glove box down and unhook it from the lower part of the dash. We have 1 Phillips head screw to remove on top of the media stack, and then there are 7 clips holding the panel in place. After removing the screw, we can go ahead and pull the panel out, disconnect it, and set it aside. Now, if your Wrangler or Gladiator came from the factory without the cold weather group or the convenience power inverter group, you can skip this step. However, if you have either of them present in your Jeep, well, we're going to have a few components here underneath the steering column that we need to remove before we can begin installing anything new. We have a cold weather module present down here at the bottom, and the power inverter is on a bracket up on top. Now, those are held in place by 2 8mm bolts down here on the lower cross member, 2 10mm bolts up here on the middle cross member, and finally, if you have a Wrangler, that power inverter is going to be secured to the top bracket with 4 10mm bolts. If you have a Gladiator, it's a slightly different inverter, and it's going to be held in place with 3 10mm bolts. We also have a couple screws here on the lower shroud of the steering column. If you remove those, we can pry this out of the way to give us a little more room to work, because this is a very tight space. We'll go ahead and remove these 2 screws first. Pull the shroud out. Next, we'll remove the 3 10mm screws, securing the inverter to the bracket. Now we need to go ahead and unplug the 4 connectors on the bottom of the cold weather module. Then we can remove the 2 10mm bolts on top of the cross member. Finally, the 2 8mm bolts on the lower cross member. Now we can drop the bracket down separate from the power inverter. And finally, we can pull down the power inverter and disconnect the two connectors on the back side of it. To prepare to run the wire for our microphone, we can start by removing the cover over the tweeter on the driver's side top of the dash. To remove the trim panel from the A-pillar and the grab handle, there are two 10mm bolts, one at the top of the grab handle, one at the bottom. Simply slide the cover out of the way, remove the two bolts, and then we can go ahead and pull, releasing the clip, removing the entire trim panel. So that we can route the wiring for our GPS antenna to the top of the sport bar, we first need to remove the interior trim panel on the sport bar above the driver's seat. It's held in place by two T25 Torx bolts on the top and two more from underneath, as well as a couple pressure clips. Once we get all the screws out of the way, we can simply pull it off, detaching it from the sport bar. Attach the microphone to the microphone clip. Install the clip onto the trim panel just behind the rearview mirror by pulling it down slightly, installing the clip, and then sliding it over just behind the sun visor clip, and then we can tuck the wiring up into the panel, running it across to the A-pillar. Before installing the GPS antenna here on top of the soundbar, it's a good idea to go ahead and clean the surface with an alcohol pad. Once the alcohol is evaporated and the surface is dry, we can go ahead and install the GPS backing plate. Then we can install the GPS antenna onto the backing plate. Pull back the double stick tape. Now with the antenna installed, we can finish running the wire behind the sport bar trim, tucking it down in place, and then we'll secure it along the inside edge of the sport bar using the included double stick clips, affixing them every couple inches down the sport bar, running the wire all the way up to the A-pillar, and finally, with the wire installed, we can go ahead and reinstall the sport bar trim that we previously removed. Now with both the microphone and the GPS wire here at the top of our A-pillar, we're going to route them following the factory wiring down the A-pillar to the top of the dash. And this is where it can come in handy to have a long fish. I like to use a long zip tie that we can snake down through the top of the dash following that factory wiring. And then we can tape our two wires to the fish. And now because of the extra length of the wire on the microphone cable, I'm going to leave everything slack for now. Once we get everything mounted and connected in its final location, I'll come back, tie up some of that loose slack, and then we can reinstall the A-pillar trim. At this point, we're ready to go ahead and grab the main wiring harness for the unit, and we're going to start here at the radio cavity in the center of the dash. Now, one leg of this harness is going to route down behind and underneath of the steering column, and another leg of the harness is actually going to route behind the vents and down into the glove box. If your OBD2 gateway is totally filled up with connectors, well, you can remove one of them and plug it into the T connector. If you've got some space, simply insert connector into one of the empty slots, and then we'll zip tie the extra wire. With the first leg behind the glove box, now we can route the second leg back behind the dash and bring it out down here below our steering column. Start by inserting the wire between the dash support brace and our HVAC vent tube. Feed it down behind the column. Next up, we have to route the key cable and the display cable from the radio cavity down underneath of the steering column as well. Now, the display cable is multi-directional. It doesn't matter which end you run. However, with the key cable, one end does have the plug for the mic. It's very important that this end ends up down below the steering column to plug into the brain of the unit, and the end without the mic plug stays up here at the radio cavity. We can attach the chime speaker behind the glove box on the flat panel to the left of the cabin air filter box. Peel the backing paper off the double stick tape on the back of the speaker. And then route the wiring up into the radio cavity, following the wiring that we routed down behind the glove box earlier. Now with our chime harness here at the radio cavity, we have one more harness that we need to run behind the dash. This is our touchscreen control harness, and it has two different ends. It has one end that has 12 pins and one end that has 6 pins. We need to run the end with 12 pins and these extra connectors down below the steering column. With all of our wires fished through the dash, we're ready to go ahead and start making some of our connections from our new Alpine harness to the existing OEM radio harness. First, we have our main connector that we can plug together, latching that closed. Next, we can grab the black FM connector and plug that into the large coax cable with the white connector. After that, we have our blue satellite cable that's going to connect to the teal connector on the dash side. Now we can grab our Maestro module and we can begin making the connections to the harness. The green connector, the small black 4-pin connector, the 3-pin connector. On the opposite side, we have the large 18-pin connector. We also need to connect the 2-pin chime speaker connector to the Maestro module. And now we can tuck the Maestro module in the left side of the radio cavity. Next up, we can grab the small braided harness, and we're going to connect the 2-pin red and black to the red camera power connector. The blue and gray is going to go to the ACC CAN connector. The other end of that harness is going to plug into the Alpine backup camera module. On the opposite side, we have a red connector, and that's going to connect with the red backup camera input signal coming from the OE harness in the dash. Now there is a series of dip switches on this module. You're going to want to refer to the instruction manual to ensure that you have the dip switches in the correct position. They are going to be different depending on whether you have a Wrangler or a Gladiator. Grab the camera input adapter, plug the connector in to the Alpine wiring harness, and then using the female to female adapter, plug one male side into the input adapter and the other male side into the backup camera module, and then we can tuck everything up into the dash. Next, we can grab the USB power wiring harness, and that's going to connect to the aux power 3-wire connector. And we can drop the other end of this harness with the 2 USB ports down behind the lower portion of the center stack. Now, before we reinstall the lower center stack on the dash, we're going to be replacing the factory media center here with the new piece from Alpine that's going to give us an aux in, 2 USB ports, one for charging, one for CarPlay and Android Auto, and an HDMI input. Now to swap this out, it's as easy as grabbing a flathead screwdriver. There's going to be 2 tabs on the bottom, 2 tabs on the top. Simply push each tab. Pull the media center out from the front, fish the wires in from the front. And push to lock in place. Now, as we're reinstalling the lower portion of the dash, we need to go ahead and fish these 3 wires, the USB, HDMI, and auxiliary cable through the dash below our steering column. Now before we start making our connections at the back of the lower stack here, grab the USB power adapter and plug it into the black USB plug. We're not going to be reusing the gray factory USB plug. Then we can plug our USB adapter into the USB power harness and the other USB plug from our new Alpine Media Center into the USB power harness. And then we can begin reconnecting all of our factory connectors. Locker and sway bar control, auxiliary switches if equipped, window control. Be sure to reconnect the locking tab, 12-volt outlet. Factory plug that previously plugged into the OE Media Center is not going to be reused. We can go ahead and assemble the screen to the display bracket. Start by laying out a soft cloth so we don't scratch the face of the screen, and we can remove this piece of styrofoam for shipping. Then turn the face of the screen over, lay it down. Take the bracket and set it on the back of the screen. The longer legs of the bracket should be towards the bottom of the screen, and we can secure it using 4 of the included Phillips head screws. Now with our display assembled to the mounting bracket, we can go ahead and install it into the dash. Before we do, we have a couple connections to make on the back side. We have our larger display connector, as well as the smaller touchscreen connector. And we can tuck that into the dash, making sure that our key connector is out the bottom. And finally, we can secure that in place using the 4 factory screws that we removed earlier. We can go ahead and reinstall the HVAC control panel. Start by connecting the start-stop electrical connector. Next, we'll connect the HVAC electrical connector, and then we can simply push the panel back into place. Now we can install the trim bezel and buttons. First, make sure we connect the key harness on the back side. Feed that under the monitor. And press the bezel in place. Now with the dash reassembled aside from below the steering column, we have a couple steps we need to do before we can install the brain of the X409 underneath of our steering wheel. We need to mount this into a new mounting bracket, and depending on what options your Jeep came from the factory with, we have a couple additional components that we need to install to that bracket. Now, if your Jeep did not come with the power inverter or with the cold weather module from the factory, you can skip this first part of the install. You're also going to find some new 8mm and 10mm hardware in your box that you can use to attach this new bracket underneath the steering column. Obviously, if you had these components from the factory, you can reuse your OE hardware to install this bracket. So the first thing we need to do to get started is to go ahead and remove our cold weather module from the OE bracket. And to do that, we're going to start by cutting the zip tie. And it's simply held in place by 3 tabs. We also need to remove the 3 speed clips that are on this OE bracket that hold the power inverter in place. Simply use a flathead screwdriver to lift the tab and pull those off. We're not going to be reusing this OE bracket, so we can set this aside. We can grab the new mounting cradle. We're going to turn that upside down, and we're going to insert those 3 tabs of the cold weather module into the underside of the bracket. Next, we need to go ahead and grab the inverter bracket, and we're going to install those 3 speed clips onto this bracket. Now, depending on whether you have a Wrangler that uses the inverter with 4 mounting points or the Gladiator that uses the inverter with 3 mounting points, you're going to be using different holes that are on this bracket. So for our Gladiator, we're going to be using the 3 outside holes. If this were a Wrangler installation, we would be using this install and the inside mounting hole. We can go ahead and secure the power inverter to the inverter bracket using the OE hardware that we removed originally. Then we can grab the source module, bracket, and source module. Now this is going to install into the bracket with the 2 tabs facing back, the large mounting tab facing forward, and with the Alpine logo in the face of the unit sliding in from the back. Slide it in until the mounting holes align on each side of the unit. Now we have a couple options at this point depending on your vehicle's configuration. If you're not going to be installing the power inverter module on top of the unit because your Jeep was not equipped with one, at this point, if you are going to be installing a Sirius XM tuner with your unit, you can mount that to the top mounting tab on the cradle right here with a pair of zip ties through the zip tie holes. If you're not going to be installing a tuner, you can skip that step. Now at this point, you can secure the source unit to the cradle using 4 of the short mounting screws, 2 on each side. However, if you're going to be reinstalling that power inverter module, it's actually going to rest right on top of that mounting tab. The mounting holes will all align, and then we'll use 2 of the short Phillips mounting screws on the side opposite of the inverter and on the side with the inverter to account for the extra thickness of the additional bracket. We're going to be using 2 of the longer Phillips screws with the star washers to ensure that it doesn't come loose from any vibration. Now, if you're going to be installing that Sirius XM tuner with the inverter, of course, we are losing the mounting spot here on the top mounting tab. Another great spot to mount that tuner is actually on the bottom side of the cold weather module. So to do that, I'm actually going to unclip the cold weather module that we previously installed. And then we're going to mount the Sirius XM tuner with the antenna connector and the data connector facing away from our existing vehicle connectors. And we can insert a pair of zip ties through the zip tie mounting locations in the tuner. And then simply secure that around that OE module. Now with the Sirius XM tuner in this location, you can see it's not blocking any of the electrical connectors on that cold weather module. And now we can go ahead and reinstall this on the mounting cradle, followed by the source unit. And I'm going to start with 2 of the small Phillips screws. Then we can set the inverter on top and using the longer Phillips screw with the star washer. And once everything's secure, we can go on to installing this underneath of the steering column. Now before we install the assembled Alpine source unit below the column here, we're going to be removing these 2 braces that are secured to this lower cross brace with a 10mm bolt at the bottom, one on the face here and one up from the bottom. At the top, on each side of the steering column, they're secured with an 8mm bolt. Now, it can be very helpful to have a long extension with a universal swivel to reach those two top bolts. Now that we've got those braces out of the way, it's worth noting that this installation method is slightly different than the way Alpine outlines it in the manual. However, while I was doing this install, I found that if you take the couple extra minutes to remove those brackets, it's going to make the job of getting the source unit assembly with all the other modules up under the column a little bit easier for you. Now, with that being said, I am going to do one other thing here. I'm actually going to remove that cold weather module and the XM tuner from the bottom of the unit before I put this up onto the dash, and we'll reinstall it once it's up in place. We can also go ahead and grab all of the wiring that we fished down from the radio cavity at this point and push it as far towards the center console as we can to give us as much access to fit the source unit and all the other components up under the dash. And you're going to want to start by slipping the unit with the inverter towards the driver's seat and the source unit going in first. We're going to go up over that center brace, tilting the unit down towards the firewall and spinning it as you move it into place. Once you're over the center, tilt it down towards the front of the firewall to allow it to drop in place, and rest the bracket on the outer and inner cross member. And we can resecure it with the factory hardware, the 10mm bolts through the top of the bracket into the outer cross member, and the two 8mm bolts on the lower cross member. Now we can pull down the factory wiring for the power inverter and reach up behind the unit and reconnect them to the back side of the inverter. Now we can also go ahead and install the cold weather module with the XM tuner zip tied to it by inserting the two tabs first and rocking it up into place, snapping it into the bracket. We can also reconnect the 4 electrical connectors on the bottom side of the cold weather module. Now we can grab all of the wiring that we push towards the center console, lift it up, and feed it over top of the power inverter bracket, dropping it down to the side. And we're doing this to make sure that we have room to reinstall this brace when we're done. We can start by connecting our display cable, followed by the main power harness. Next, we have the HDMI cable, which is going to go on the left side, which is the HDMI in. Next up, we have the touchscreen control for the monitor, followed by the key control harness, CAN bus harness, then the USB connector. For our GPS antenna, remember we fished these down from the A-pillar a little bit earlier. You're gonna have to feed that up over the top of the unit. So we'll feed the microphone connector, which will plug into the mic in. You can also connect the FM to the FM antenna input. We have the auxiliary input, plugs into the aux in. We can also feed the XM connector, if present, up over the top of the unit. Plug that into the satellite connector. And the satellite antenna connector we can feed down and plug into the Sirius XM tuner. And the last connector is the pre-outs, which should all be capped. Now, alternatively, if you're not hooking up any external amplifiers at this point, you could leave this harness disconnected just for space reasons. Now with everything connected here to the source unit underneath of the steering column, before we tie everything up here with some zip ties and reinstall all of the dash panels, this is a great time to go ahead and reconnect those negative terminals on the battery so that we can power on the unit and verify that everything's working correctly. Now once we've done that, we can come back making sure that we reinstall both of those lower dash support pieces. Then we can resecure the steering column shroud as well as the lower panel here on the driver's side. Zip tie the wires behind the glove box as well as reinstalling the glove box. And last, we can go ahead and reinstall that A-pillar trim. Once we pop that tweeter grill back in place, we can go ahead and fire it up. And of course, we've got one last step. That's to go ahead and remove that film from our brand new 9-inch screen. Now, if you guys have any comments or questions about how to get your Alpine X409 installed in your 2018 or newer Jeep Wrangler JL or 2020 and up Jeep Gladiator JT, you can always leave those for us in the comment section below or contact us directly at any of the options on the screen. You'll definitely want to click that info button to head over to quadratec.com to get more information and purchase an X409 for your Jeep. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you're sure to catch all of our latest install videos. Till next time, I'm Rob. I'll see you guys out on the trail.